Okay, so here I am, getting towards the middle of the afternoon. Lots of fans waving and lots of tired-looking faces. You want to just shake your shoulders a little bit and buckle in, because we have a long ride, a whole hour, to talk about family skills and family interventions and how we understand this interplay between an individual with dysregulated emotion and his or her parents. And I'm going to focus on parents and teens, although almost everything I have to say would be similarly applicable to any close relationship. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting, if you've been around for a while, you know that for about 50 years now, we've understood that there's a clear relationship between individual distress and psychopathology on one hand, and parent, partner, and family distress and dysfunction on the other hand. In fact, intellectual wars have been waged over this relationship, with some people saying, notice how I've got an arrow going both ways, okay? But for years, people thought about, was the arrow going that way, or should the arrow go this way? Now, being dialectical, it's very easy. Of course the arrow goes in both directions. And that's what I want to talk about today, is this transaction. How, in fact, an individual with his or her own distressed emotion has an impact on relationships that actually isn't good for the relationship, and then the relationship, meaning the other person and persons, do things in return that aren't good for the individual. Oh, I just soaked myself with my water. I'm nice and cool now. Hey, I recommend it. Get some cold water and dump it on yourself. It's quite refreshing. Okay, so anyway, so the question of what this process is, because it's not enough to simply say, oh, it makes you feel, everybody knows, isn't it the best day of your life? You have a big argument with your teen or your partner. Isn't that a great day? You wake up in the morning and go, oh, let's have a nasty argument. I'll have such a good day if I do that. Everybody knows this is not helpful. Knowing it isn't enough to change it, of course. Now, as Marie Paul talked about this morning, and Armida did as well, and so forth, we have this transactional model, which in its simplest form simply says that what one person does has an impact on the other, and what the other person does reciprocally feeds back. That's all. This isn't actually particularly complicated at some level, nor is it actually all that controversial. I mean, this is kind of basic, and everybody knows this. The details are where the devil lies, as we say. So, we've done a bunch of studies that show that, in fact, we're trying to figure out what are the specific things that people are doing in this transaction. What specifically? And, of course, our interests have to do, my interests have for a long time had to do with validating and invalidating responses. And so here you see a study that I did with one of my doctoral students, Chad Schenk. And what we looked at were parents of clinic teens, they're the yellow bars, and compared them to a matched control sample of the parents of non-clinic teens. We put them in a room, we asked them to talk about how their relationships in their family were going, we left the room, put on a camera. And they knew they were being recorded, of course. Then we have people who don't know anything about them, using a rating scale, rate how validating or invalidating the parents are. And as you can see, the parents of the clinic teens are much less validating and much more invalidating than the parents of the non-clinic teen, the control sample, if you will. And if you look at it differently, the yellow to yellow, the parents of the clinic teens are invalidating a lot more than they're validating. Whereas the control sample parents are validating a lot more than they're invalidating. Now, this isn't to blame parents, okay, that's part of it. This is part of the reason transactions are hard to study, because you're kind of looking at one set of behaviors independent of the other, or the other set of behaviors independent of the one. And we actually have some ways to do that I'm not going to go into, but this is the kind of evidence that we try to use to say, well, what are those key behaviors in this transaction that actually fuel dysfunction, or ideally, fuel functionality? So let's start with this idea of well, what's healthy? Okay, well, what's healthy is one person expresses him or herself in an accurate way. Accurate meaning descriptive, part of reality, okay? And the other person, because it's accurate, it's pretty easy to understand, right? If I'm crossing the street, if I've got the crosswalk, this little sign that says it's okay to cross, and I go to cross the street, and a car comes around the corner very fast, doesn't stop even though I'm supposed to be able to cross the street, and I jump out of the way, okay? And then I see you 30 seconds later. You say, what happened? I said, well, I just almost got run over by this car. I just got really scared, okay? Notice, I just almost was run over by a car. I got really scared. It's very descriptive. It's very easy to understand, right? The chances are you're going to say, what? What are you going to say? Without having to be a family therapist or a DBT therapist or anybody. What do you say?
That was terrible. How horrible.
Yeah, you do something. Guess what? It's very validating because it's easy to understand. You don't say, well, you didn't get hit by the car. You have no reason to be upset any longer, right? You don't do that, right? So, and of course, because the person's validating, the other person feels understood. Ah, you understand, which actually, interestingly, helps the person's emotions go down. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. Now, it's more complicated because in order to express ourselves accurately, accurate expression requires the person has to manage their emotion enough to become aware of his or her own emotions, desires, goals, what my experience really is, and then needs to be able to accept that that is what it is, that it shouldn't be different than what it is, and then be able to simply say so descriptively. That's what makes it easy for you to understand. And of course, for the other person to validate, okay, a validating response requires the validating person has to manage his or her own emotions enough to bring attention to the other person, right? Therefore, can pay attention to the other person. Gee, what is your experience right now? What's it like to be you? You know, you asked a really important question about cross-cultural validity of, sorry, using the word in different ways, validity of validation. And this is why it's cross-culturally valid to do so, because it's, what's your experience? And if I don't understand it, why is it, how is it your experience? And the idea is, it is your experience. That's a given, okay? Then we have to understand, well, how come? Right, so if I were up here feeling, okay, so now I'm feeling nice and cool, okay, because I have cold water spilled on myself. Okay, I could say, well, gee, you have no reason to be warm back there. You're fanning yourself. Why? It's nice and cool in here. Right? Well, I'm really not thinking about what it's like to be you right now. Okay? So, in order to be able to validate, we have to manage our emotion, bring our attention to the other person. We call that relationship mindfulness. We have to actually understand it. We can't validate until we understand. Validation isn't saying I understand, but it's not true. It's saying what I understand that I really do understand. Okay? It's validating the valid and being able to communicate what I do understand. And I might not understand the whole thing. Of course, some behaviors are valid in some ways and not valid in others. Right? I mean, if you're on a really hot day, if you have the flu, you might actually have cold chills, right? Well, that's valid because you have the flu, not because it's, to everybody else, a cold day. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do. So we can understand borderline personality disorder as a kind of prototype, okay, an umbrella, if you will, under which other problems with emotion dysregulation, other diagnoses can fit. We know that there are multiple co-occurring disorders that show up. Armida talked about several of them, and there are many, many more that are understandable under this umbrella of dysregulated emotion. Gee, okay, it makes sense that somebody might be depressed if when I'm depressed, and the alarm goes off and I think about my day and I get overwhelmed, and then if I hit the go back to sleep button, roll back over, pull a blanket over my head, well, I just managed my distress, I just managed my negative emotion by withdrawing. My depressive behavior just got reinforced. That's dysregulated emotion. And drug use can be understood in the same way, eating disordered behaviors in the same way, and so forth and so on. And so then, as professionals, as family members, we're less overwhelmed. Okay? We've got one set of problems that are related instead of 7 different diagnoses that require, oh my goodness, 7 different professionals. Okay, and Marie Paul showed this diagram earlier. So the idea is that emotion dysregulation is in the center of this and has an impact on all of these individual problems, and those problems themselves exacerbate or make emotion dysregulation worse. Okay? Now, the question is, of course, what's the role of close relationships in this? First, I just want to emphasize that emotion dysregulation is not the same as simply being upset. Okay? Most of us, most of the time when we're upset, we're perfectly regulated. Okay? So just because you're upset about something, don't like something, you know, the situation of getting almost run over by a car, hyperventilating, actually, not necessarily dysregulated. I got out of the way and I'm describing it to you. That's pretty regulated. I'm just upset. And my arousal's going to come down. Okay? So dysregulated is a little bit different and more specific. Now that's kind of what dysregulation looks like. The more whites of the eye you see, the more dysregulation there is. That's a very important diagnostic consideration. So emotion dysregulation really means that the person becomes more focused on the immediate reduction of their painful emotional arousal. Okay? Think about it from the perspective of a headache. Okay? I assume, I'm sorry, but it's probably true. I assume everybody's had a headache at some point, right? If you've got an ordinary headache, you might get up with your headache and bring it with you to work, right? You can get in the car or you can hop on the bus and you can go to work and bring your headache with you and be 80-90% effective. And every once in a while notice your headache, but go back to work and do the things you need to do, okay? But if you've ever had a kind of headache, I've actually never had one, but I think migraines fall into this category, the kind of headache where you can't get in the car and drive. You can't hop on the bus and ride. You can't focus at work. The headache is too big. You know what I mean, right? That is a dysregulated headache. And if we substitute negative or painful emotion for headache, that's emotion dysregulation. When the painful emotion is so painful, you're not just upset, but now you can't stand it. The focus becomes, I got to get rid of this, okay? Or sometimes that I anticipate that I'm going to feel that bad, even though I don't yet, and so the focus becomes, I can't let myself get to feel that bad. Really good drug addicts do that. You know what I mean? I'm not saying really good in a judgmental way, but I mean they're good at being drug addicts. Okay. So now the reality is that most of these very dysregulated behaviors that lead to suicide attempts, for example, and self-harm, the vast majority of those have at their origin an event that's social and relational. Okay, important relationships, an argument, being dumped. Okay, people have what we call rejection sensitivity or fears of abandonment. Being told, I don't want to see you ever again. I want to ever talk to you. I'm taking you out of my phone. Okay, or being lonely is a relational event. Those kinds of things are very important. And then people become, Then people become either, they become reactive and impulsive and either attack the other person or withdraw from the other person. And then many possible other dysfunctional things can occur. All right, so emotion dysregulation. Now I want to present this transactional model, and I want to say that it's applicable to all of us, okay? Because although on the one hand, I said, most of the time we're upset, we're not dysregulated. On the other hand, everybody gets dysregulated sometimes, okay? Anybody ever said something mean to someone you love? Be honest. There's like 3 honest people in the room right now. Okay? Yeah. That was a dysregulated moment, okay? Right? Because your short-term behavior, saying something mean to someone you love, that's important to someone you love, that means that to someone you love, your long-term goals are to have a good relationship with someone you love. I'm making that assumption. Saying something mean actually is contrary to your goals. So that's a dysregulated behavior. So for all of us at those moments, and for people with borderline personality disorder who become more frequently dysregulated, that's really the big difference. Here's how it works, okay? So the idea is something starts. There's an event. Often that event is a relational event, although it doesn't have to be, but it most often is. Now, this first source of emotion is not dysregulated at all, okay? We call this a primary emotion. The emotion we have that's in response to what actually happens in this moment is our primary emotion. So if I describe a series of scenarios to you, you could, without having to know anybody's age, gender, culture, anything, you could say what the person's like. I said, I almost got run over by a car. What's my emotion? Fear, right? You don't have to really know anything about me other than I'm a human being, right? If I say, oh, someone, my very, very best friend just moved away, very, very far away. How do I feel? Right, stuff like that. So that emotion it's emotion for sure. It's heightened emotional arousal, but it is not yet dysregulated. It's just emotion. That might be what we would call upset. Although sometimes the events are positive, relational events, and this emotion could be positive. It doesn't have to be painful. It could be enjoyable. Okay, so that's one source. Hang on to that one. The second source of arousal has to do with our vulnerability, okay? Now it's important to think about, is vulnerability to what? Vulnerability to getting dysregulated, which is very contextual, okay? Now some of that we talk about as temperament. We sometimes reduce temperament to biology as a shorthand, but I want to be clear. Our temperament is our present biology, our present sensitivity and reactivity and how long it takes to return to baseline. And temperament is not static. It doesn't change quickly, not in days or weeks or months, but it does change in years, right? Like some of us might have been very timid children, but are very outgoing as adults, or vice versa. I mean, things like that. More sensitive as children, less sensitive as we get older, and so forth. So the one piece of vulnerability is temperamental, our ordinary sensitivity to emotional stimuli, our reactivity, and how long it takes to, if we don't do anything, to naturally come back down to our baseline. But a second source of vulnerability is also biological, and that's absolutely in this moment. Like if you're hungry, if you're tired, if you're overheated, okay? Those kinds of things. If you have a headache, if you have a backache, those things make us more vulnerable to getting dysregulated also, okay? Second biological component, but very transient biologically. Okay? Something that we could change. If you're hungry, we can feed you. If you're tired, we can give you a nap. That ought to reduce your vulnerability pretty quickly. Okay? And then the third source of vulnerability is what's been going on lately. Where is my present baseline? Did I just have a lovely interaction with a dear friend? Or did I just have a big blowout argument with a distant cousin who's always trying to borrow money and says nasty things about me on Facebook? Okay? Those things change my baseline and also make me, if I'm higher on my baseline, more vulnerable to getting dysregulated. Think about it, if my baseline is up here, not so far to go before I get dysregulated. If my baseline is down here, I have a lot more room before I get dysregulated. So there are multiple sources of vulnerability, which all of them I'm going to lump together and say that's our second source of arousal. So you can see if a person has a lot of vulnerability, the event itself does not have to be all that big for that person. Okay? Of course, what's big for the person is up to the person, but for the same person on a different day with more vulnerability, they may have a lot bigger reaction. Okay? Or the same event to somebody with different temperament might be a different reaction. Okay? So you could also have a very big event and a lot of vulnerability, and you can see this box starts to get very big very quickly. Now the third source of emotional arousal has to do with how we process cognitively what's going on around us. So if we get judgmental about the event, okay, or ourselves, that is going to increase our vulnerability. Now, judgments are a very special kind of appraisal. It puts a specific valence, a spin. Instead of saying, this driver came ripping around the corner and didn't stop and almost hit me, okay, I can just focus on my fear. But if I say, can I curse here? Is that okay? This asshole came around the corner, okay? Now notice, what emotion am I getting into now? Yeah, notice I'm leaving. The fear is still clearly going to be there, right? Because I almost just got hit by the car. But now I'm transforming the emotion into another emotion, a secondary emotion, by being judgmental. Or, oh, I was such an idiot. Even though I had the walk sign, I didn't stop and look both ways. Okay, now I'm such an idiot. Now I'm starting to feel what emotion? Yeah, I feel a little embarrassed. I'm blaming myself. I'm moving away from fear to a different emotion. Now that's also contributing here. Now notice this arrow goes in both directions. That's because we know that when our emotion gets high enough, our ability to maintain complex thinking goes right out the window. We've known this since 1908, the sort of famous upside down Yerkes-Dodson stuff, right? That when arousal gets high enough, we can't think straight anymore. Okay? So what that means is that even if we aren't judgmental when we start, if we get dysregulated or close to being dysregulated, we'll start being judgmental because we start to parse the world into right and wrong, good and bad, threat and no threat, which in turn feeds back and makes this arousal even higher. Okay? That's why high arousal almost always tips into dysregulation. You get high enough. And once dysregulated, it's hard to just break out of that cycle right away. Okay? Because it almost always includes judgment. The trouble is, the judgments are often the things that we say. Right? You know, that asshole came around the corner. Well, that's tricky. I'll show you why it's tricky in a second. All right, so now lots of models, even if they bought this, they would stop here and say, okay, that person, enough of this stuff, enough of number one, enough of number two, enough of number three. We get dysregulated, and when we're dysregulated, we do all kinds of behaviors that become focused on reducing our negative and painful emotion. Fair enough. But there's more. This might be enough, by the way. This could happen, and this could be enough to dysregulate somebody. However, that's not typically what happens. What happens typically is then the person says something, expresses something. Okay? This is what Michael was talking about. You know, sometimes behavior is meant to express something. As Mary Zanarini says, you know, somebody hits themselves in the face with a hammer. It's hard to hear that as I'm really lonely. It's not accurate, okay? But it's still, that's what's in this box, is I'm so lonely I can't stand it, but then overdosing or self-harm, it's very hard to see loneliness behind it. But a teen with problems with emotion regulation gets dysregulated and often expresses inaccurately. And by the way, that inaccurate expression could just be in our own heads. It doesn't have to be to another person, okay? But when it is to another person, of course, what happens? If I express myself inaccurately, okay, so the person coming around the corner was your boyfriend or girlfriend, okay? It was your partner. And I say, that asshole almost ran me down. What do you say? Oh, it's hard to validate, isn't it? Yeah, I don't hear a lot of validation coming. I got a lot more validation the first time, right? Okay. Right? Because the inaccurate is harder to understand. If I had said, you know, somebody came around the corner, I almost got hit. Whew, I'm so scared. It's different. Well, am I angry? What do I want? What do I want from you? Am I complaining to you about your partner? What am I doing? So inaccurate expression. So here's the problem. And this is a huge problem for therapists, but it's also a problem for family members. Just because we don't understand, okay, in the face of accurate expression, doesn't mean, okay, it doesn't mean that the person's experiences are wrong or crazy, okay, or don't make sense. It just means we don't understand it. The other person might be making it hard to understand by being inaccurate, but the experience could make sense if we had more information. And so that's our job. It's our job as therapists, but it's certainly our job as family members to try to make sense of it. Instead of saying, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or you shouldn't talk that way, it's like, something else. And that something else, of course, remember, there's going to be validating. But in fact, what actually happens is the other person is much more likely to invalidate when it's inaccurate. The person doesn't understand. Or what the person does understand is simply the judgments. But the judgments are judgments. It's hard to validate judgments. They aren't true. They're judgments, and they're usually painful. But don't forget the person who's doing the invalidating also has his or her own vulnerabilities Those are her own levels of emotional pain, and those are her own judgments that make it easier or harder to see through the inaccurate expression to what actually happened. Okay? And of course, this is typically a parent. Okay? And so the kid comes home from school and says, slams the door, goes and sulks in the corner, and the parent says, "What's the matter?" And which isn't bad. It's not, sort of noticing that there's something going on. And the kid says, everybody hates me. Well, you might say it's probably not true that everybody, I haven't yet, we're coming close in America now, but I haven't yet met anybody that 7 billion people hate. Okay? Sorry, I couldn't help myself. So, we've got this, I don't think 7 billion people hate you, sweetie. That sounds like quite parent. I don't think 7 billion people hate you. What's your team going to do when you say that? Flip you off and go to another room, right? It's like, you don't understand, and then leave, right? Because that was actually not, the teen wasn't accurate. It wasn't literally a statement that nobody likes me. It was something else. We don't know what it was, but it was something else. And so if we can, instead of invalidating and saying, "Oh, that's not true, your family loves you, and I'm going to tell you, I know so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so all like you very much." Well, strangely enough, that just makes the kid feel worse. Because in reality, invalidating responses push arousal up further. Okay? You know this, right? Right? You come home, had a lousy day, and you get invalidated. Doesn't that just make your day, it's just the whipped cream on top of the ice cream sundae. Right? Okay. And of course, if the first 3 sets of origins for arousal weren't enough to get the person dysregulated, this last one will. Okay? Now, of course, there's more to it. Okay? So, invalidating responses create more dysregulation, and more dysregulation create more invalidation. The last piece here, though, number 5, is that when this happens consistently or pervasively, it happens over and over and over again. It doesn't have to be from a parent, but it just happens. It could be a cultural mismatch. For example, we know that refugees have borderline personality disorders at about twice the rate of non-refugees in most countries. Okay? That might be because there's more cultural invalidation in those situations. Okay? So that pervasive history makes people more sensitive. Okay? Which in turn, of course, contributes to further dysregulation. So we have these 5 sources of dysregulation. Now, it's not really for me to talk about what DBT is. DBT, of course, you can think about DBT as a treatment that has something for every arrow in every box on this slide. Trying to, in fact, help people get more regulated and help their families be engaged in that process. DBT intervenes on each arrow in each box. But for families, I hope you can see where I'm going, right? For families, if family members can change this box, that's going to reduce this arrow in a big way, which of course reduces this arrow in a big way, which reduces sensitivity in a big way, and family members also can reduce negative events in their family. Well, all kinds of stuff can happen when we intervene with families. All right, so what can we do to help parents and families around these issues? What skills can we help them learn? All right, so I'm going to step through, I think, 4 different sets of clusters, if you will, of skills for parents and family members, and try and be very practical about this. Okay, so the essential things that we can help family members do. Okay, so the first one, of course, has to do with, can we help people pay attention to managing their own emotions, okay, and their own judgments in different ways before engaging in any kind of discussion, okay? Because sometimes, remember that earlier slide, sometimes what the teen expresses is inaccurate. It provokes the parent, which then makes things much worse. Anybody here have children? Okay, good. Okay, so we have 4. Okay, we're on our 4th teenager now. So I don't have little ones anymore, but I suppose, when you take kids to something, I don't know, what's the most exciting thing to do with a 5-year-old in Puerto Rico? What's the most exciting thing for a 5-year-old to do here? Like a Disneyland, Puerto Rico, what's the equivalent? The beach, okay. So you take your kids, you've got a 5-year-old, and you go out in the morning and you have a day at the beach, and of course it's not just a day at the beach, it's a day full of like way too much sugary food, right? Lots of sun, okay, and utter exhaustion at the end of the day. So now it's 8 o'clock at night, okay, and you're coming home. What's your 5-year-old doing?